Okay, let's talk a little bit about the grandparents. I never knew Martin Hogh, my paternal grandfather. I knew of him. He died the year before I was born. He died in 1938. I wasn't born until 1939. I do remember him saying that, not him, but the people around him saying about some of the things that happened to him. When he was in Denmark and a carpenter, one night he was building a casket, burial casket, by candlelight. Of course, you know, this would have been in about probably 1880. And the candle went out 3 times. So he took that as an omen and he gave up and didn't work on the casket anymore that night. He came to America, you know, at age 36, which is with a family, which is a pretty brave undertaking. I don't know how things were over there, probably not that good, but I'm sure he was glad he did. He wasn't very careful with money, unfortunately. He financed the blacksmith shop in Goodwin, which when they got into be a machinery dealer, and lost a lot of money on that deal. He also bought shares in the Midland Packing company, and I don't know if that was fraudulent or not, but anyway, people lost a lot of money in it. Shirley and I have been in the building, they call it the KD station afterwards. It's since been torn down. It was a, excuse me, it was designed as a packing plant back in the around 1920. And then later on they had antique shops and things like that in it. But he put a bunch of money in it and wound up with nothing, as did probably all of the investors, or most of them anyway. He had asthma all his life, wasn't in the best of health, although he lived to be 82 years old. And I do remember my Uncle Dick telling me that on Armistice Day, which is November 11th, 1918, almost 100 years ago, he came home. Apparently he'd been over to Goodwin and told Grandpa, no more corn picking today, the war is over. They were picking corn, and so it was all over. And that was the year he decided to move to town, which turned out to be not such a good idea. But I guess it was nice while it lasted. And then he died in 1938, died in our house, and was buried in Graceland Park Cemetery. I understand that there was a strike going on at Swift's, I think it is, the packing plant, and the National Guard was down there guarding the people saw it when they went to the funeral, you know, and they went out to the cemetery. Had to go right past there. Grandma she was the oldest child in the family, a big family. The name was Mogensen. In Denmark, the way the system worked at that time was every generation the name changed. You took your father's name and added a son to it. Her father's name was Mogens Christensen. So she and her brothers and her sister became Mogensen, Mogensen. And there's still a lot of them around here. They all came to America except the one who died young. There was one died young. And when they reused his name, his name was actually Lawrence, but they always called him Louie. And we did have an Uncle Louie, lived in the South Sioux, long since dead, of course. He had lived at Hubbard when he was younger and was farming. He was director of a bank over there, and then when the Depression hit and all the banks went under, people lost money in the bank, and he felt responsible for it, so he impoverished himself by reimbursing them as much as he could. But anyway, Grandma and her sister, Martha, immigrated together. They came over from Denmark at the same time on the same ship. Grandma was a very timid individual, and I'm a little surprised she did come, but I guess she didn't have much choice. Her fiancé was here. He was at Sergeant Bluff, there was a Danish settlement at Sergeant Bluff. So she went down there, and as soon as she got there, they got married, and they had 2 children. But as I say, she was a very, very timid individual, didn't like change, was most reluctant to move to Nebraska because she didn't know anybody there. Well, then she got there, and the plan was to move to the other, the land that Grandpa owned when he got buildings built on it. Well, she heard that farm was for sale, so nothing doing on that. She didn't want to get out of there because she at least knew some people there. And she was, I guess when she lived in Sioux City and she had to go downtown a couple of times a year, she'd worry about that for days beforehand. Somewhat of a worrywart, in other words. I remember Aunt Martha saying that one day they were discussing, Uncle Louie and Martha and Grandma, some people who had left their families and immigrated, and that was terrible. Shouldn't do that. It's an awful thing to do to the parents. And he said to her, well, you did it. She says, we had to. So I suppose the poverty was such that there was nothing there for them, so they had to come. But they did leave. All their parents stayed. Their 2 parents stayed behind, and all the children came here, and they all lived close here, and they're all buried in Graceland, really close to each other, except for her other sister, Martha. She's buried in Homer, and with her husband. They had a general store in Hubbard. I don't remember her. She died before I was born. I remember him. His name was Carl Andersen, and he had a general store. We were over there one day, one Sunday, we were sitting down to eat, and he cooked. He was a cook because his wife had been dead quite a while. Anyway, somebody pulled in, wanted gas. It was a gas station too, so he had to go out and pump the gas before he could eat. But I think now my dad was a lot like her, and Martha was a lot like her. Now, Annie Petersen, that was Grandma's second child, a daughter. She was the other way. She'd go anywhere, do anything. She went to Europe for the first time at age 84. At age 84. She wasn't alone. Her son and daughter-in-law were with her, but they went over to visit some of her husband's relatives. He was a native of Denmark, and they went over to visit some of them, and she loved it. And then after she got home from there, she flew to California, so she had a really busy year that year, the year she was 84. But she lived on a farm over at Hubbard. Was very, she was small, but she was mighty, very strong, worked like a slave all her life. She used to raise chickens. She'd get 500 chickens on Valentine's Day, and most of them she would sell as dressed chickens. She'd dress them for a quarter. Can you believe that? But she loved it. She thrived on it and loved it, and had a lot of energy and a lot of, she enjoyed life, I think, but had a difficult time. Her first husband died of pneumonia in 1919 when she had 4 small children. But there again, she had a bachelor brother who came to live with them, and he did the farming, so she could stay on that farm for a while. And then for a while, they lived with us. And then she married, us meaning in our house with Dad, because none of us were around yet. And then She married George Petersen, and they had one child. And they're all dead now. All the children are dead. But she lived to be 93, lived to a ripe old age. But then my maternal grandparents, Grandpa Walsh lived with us. Well, his grandma did too, for that matter, most of the time. And we'd go up to pump water. The neighbor had pasture not far from us, and he hired Grandpa to go up and pump water. He had a gasoline engine and a pump jack, and a lot of cattle in his pasture. The two of them, actually, the two neighbors, so he'd go up there every afternoon to pump water, and I'd go with him, and we had a great time. He'd pump water, and then he'd come back home. Grandpa was a very ambitious individual. He was working all the time. He could do just about anything. I remember asking my mother, excuse me, there's a blacksmith shop in Ponca, and I asked her it's an old, it's a pioneer type thing, and they keep it, it's beautiful. I asked her, did Grandpa go there, or was there one in Martinsburg? She said, oh, there's one in Martinsburg. But he didn't go there, he did it all himself. He could shoe horses, he had a forge, and he could sharpen the plows or do whatever he had to do. But you go back to when he was born in 1872, you had to do it yourself. There was nobody around to do it. And he was born up there in Dixon County. And he shod the horses and plows. He could make just about anything. Axe handle would break. He wouldn't buy an axe handle. He'd make one. Rake handle, the hoe handle. He'd just make one. It wasn't as perfect, but it worked. So he'd do that. And he was tough. He was a tough man, but unfortunately he drank too much. Quite a bit too much. But he was sort of a character. I was really impressed one time. He told me that Martinsburg was named after a man named Jonathan Martin. And he told me that he knew him. Well, I was like 6, 7 years old. I thought that was a big deal. You know the man the town's named after. And he did, of course. So Jonathan Martin lived to be 99 years old, and he's buried up there towards Martinsburg. But anyway, they had to come to Dakota County back in 1926. And occasionally he would go with the mailman to Jackson to get a haircut. Now, Dad would have taken him to get a haircut. But after he got the haircut, he could go to the bar. So then that night, we'd have to go find him and bring him home. And I remember one night, he came in we have a porch with a door on both ends. Well, he came in the north end of the door, and of course he'd been drinking. He went out, went all the way out the south end and fell down. He never got hurt though. But then came January 1947. The weather was bad. There was a blizzard going on, and that particular night he was ravenously hungry. I remember I don't really notice that myself, but my mom did, because he kept asking her, how soon will supper be ready? And I guess he ate heartily that night. Well, the next morning he got up, everything was fine. He was outside, and Dad was outside. There's a building behind our house we called the wash house, because years ago they did laundry in it. There's a stove in there, and the washing machine was in there. Those days you had to pump the water and carry it into the stove and heat it and put it in the washing machine. We had no drains in the basement or anything like we do now. Well, anyway, they were out there at the doorway of the wash house, and he collapsed. And Dad caught him. He was standing right beside him. He didn't hit the ground. So there was a back door. He brought him to the back door and knocked on the door. Knocked or called or something. Anyway, I answered the door. course, you could see that he was unconscious. So they got a chair, and my mom was there, and they got a chair and put him on it and carried him into the bedroom, put him on the bed. I know Mom said she thought he was dead then because it was the way his head was, But anyway, they put him on the bed. Well, there was a blizzard, and we had no phone. But they had a phone over in Goodwin at Duggan's house, so Dad would have gone over there. It had to walk, you couldn't drive over there. But she didn't want to be alone in the house with him. And just the kids, and we were pretty small. So she went over there. She walked over to Goodwin, and Dad stayed with us, and she called the doctor and called Aunt Gertrude, and then the county did open up the road. They came with the snowplow, and they even opened up the driveway. And pretty soon the doctor and the priest came, and the hearse came, and I remember seeing them carry him out on a stretcher to the hearse. And in 1987, I saw the same thing with Dad. They carried him out through the same door to the hearse that was waiting outside. So anyway, Grandpa died very suddenly, died on his feet. And then at his funeral, the weather was really bad. So Grandma couldn't go. They took her up to the funeral home the day before. She was at Aunt Gertrude's, and then the rest of us got stranded at Aunt Gertrude's for I don't know how long, 2 or 3 days, because it was really bad getting home. And then we had a great time, though, all crowded in that little house. But we had a great time, and then finally we could get home. But I remember the day of the funeral, they didn't bury him. There was a mausoleum out in that cemetery, Calvary Cemetery, so they put the body in there till spring. I can still feel, it was stone floor, I can still feel the cold on my feet at that floor of the mausoleum. Oh, it was cold. And it was bitter cold, it was bitter cold. So then Grandpa was gone, and nobody to go up and pump water with anymore, so that was the end of that. And then Grandma, of course, had poor health all her life. Most of her life she had diabetes and had a good-sized family. And Grandpa, when he was drunk, was abusive, and he was drunk more than he should have been, that's for sure. Well, any is more than you should have been, but anyway, I say she had a difficult life, and they didn't have much money because if he'd sell a load of hogs or cattle or something, he'd go to town to get the check. Well, he'd usually wind up being robbed before he got home. He'd go to a bar, and because I know Grandma always, her whole life, she wanted a marker put on Kitty's grave, their daughter, Every time they'd sell them, well, it never got done. Finally, Aunt Gertrude did it back in the 50s. So there is a marker on the grave. But they're buried in Calvary. They're not buried in South Creek. Well, for one thing, the weather was really bad. You couldn't get out there. And at the time, the consensus was that the cemeteries in town were better maintained than the ones in the country. So anyway, they buried them here. They're buried in Sioux City. It's on the other side of town. Graceland is not far from Louise's, where the paternal grandparents are, but Calvary is on the other side of town. It's the Catholic cemetery. But Grandma was a very gentle, long-suffering woman, and she had a lot to suffer. She had poor health and an abusive husband, but she used to read to me. I remember she'd read to me when I was little, and she couldn't hear. Her hearing was really, really bad. couldn't get around very well because of the severe case of rheumatism as well as the diabetes. She was born in Dubuque in 1877, baptized in the cathedral on Christmas Day. I did find a record of her baptism over there. And then shortly after she was born, I don't know just how long, her father died. She was the youngest of a big family. And two of them were already married. But then her mother moved to Omaha. I'm quite sure she had relatives in Omaha. Her mother's name was Quinlan, and there are a lot of Quinlans in Omaha. And some of them, maybe most of them, were related to her. So she moved to Omaha. Grandma worked in a laundry down there as a child. You know, those days they had child labor. She worked in a laundry. But anyway, she was baptized on Christmas Day, the youngest of the family. Two of them were already married. Shortly after she was born, and I don't know just how long, her father died, Mike Tracy, and I don't know what happened to him. I know he worked on the river boats in the Mississippi. It's possible that he drowned. I could find no obituary, no record of death, no place of burial. I know I went to the cathedral. They've got a book listing things, you know, deaths, burials, and marriages. Unfortunately, the one for the time period I needed is missing. Naturally, it would be. And I checked with them several years later, and it never had turned up, so that, I guess, is gone forever. But I went out to a cemetery, a place called Key West, and they gave me their books, and I looked all through there, and I could find no record of burial. So it's possible he might have drowned in the river someplace away from Dubuque, and the body never found. I don't know. I really don't know about that. But we don't really have any contact with any of Grandma's siblings, unfortunately. The only one that the aunts ever saw was her brother Jack Tracy. He was an old bachelor, and he lived in Dixon County much of his life. And as far as when Grandma died, I remember it vividly, but I wasn't over there. We were over there July 4th, which was a Sunday. You know, we spent the day over there and shot fireworks and had a picnic and everything else out in the yard. We didn't go to the timber or anything because Grandma couldn't get out of bed by then. But so that was the last time I saw her. And then the next day, being the 5th, we had company. Uncle Louie and Aunt Martha came, and they brought Carl and Regina, another aunt and uncle, and they were planning to go over there too, but they never made it. But that particular day, another aunt and uncle, Dick and Carrie, did go over. They were over to Fred's, and Grandma was fine, you know, talked and everything else. But then around, I think it was shortly after midnight, Aunt Mary said that she turned on the flashlight. She had a flashlight, and that was a signal that something was wrong. So she came in, and the only thing she said was priest, but she was having a stroke apparently. So Shirley rode over to Merchants, and they called Father O'Sullivan and Dr. McGurl, and then Aunt Mary said that at the time that she died, there was a shadow that went up the shade, you know, the window shade, and up to the ceiling, and then disappeared. And I never saw anything like that before or since. But you ask Gertrude about that, she knows about that. Probably more than I do. And then I didn't know about it until the next morning. They didn't get us up. I mean, somebody came over and told Mom and Dad. Mary Lou and Milo did. They came over and told them, but they didn't wake me. And then next morning when I got up, they told me Grandma had died. So. And then her funeral was in the summertime. It was, wake was at O'Toole's in Sioux City, which is now O'Toole's. It's no longer there. It's now Meyer Brothers, and they're still in business, but they're in different places. The urban renewal cleared out that area, so there's no funeral home there where it used to be. Her funeral was in Jackson. Grandpa's was in Sioux City as much because of the weather as anything else. But Grandma's was in Sioux City, and then I remember standing there at graveside. I was there, Dick was there, Bob Walsh was there, and of course they're both long dead, and I'm still around. But we were standing there together at the graveside. There was a snake came along, started running towards the grave, so they chased him away. They didn't want him getting into Grandma's grave. He was deathly afraid of snakes. So she was buried there, but I remember her well. She was a very, very good woman, a very kind woman. Always treated us all beautifully. Patient. Grandpa was patient too with the grandchildren. He was never crabby with us. Ask Gertrude about this, but there's a cemetery. It's a fair distance from home, but I'll bet it's probably 1.5 miles. You have to go south of our house quite a ways, through somebody's pasture, and then to another one. There's this little cemetery. Most of the graves have been removed by now. Well, one time, she ordered him to take her to the cemetery. The hottest day of the year. I remember her telling about it. It was still, he says, it was the hottest day of the year and you got to go there. So I think they walked out there. Because Grandpa he loved to walk, and he was always out in the pasture, picking grapes or picking something, mushrooms. We used to eat mushrooms, but after he died, Mom wouldn't cook them anymore because she didn't think any of us knew enough to distinguish the poisonous ones from the good ones. But he always did. So anyway, that's a little bit about the grandparents and what I know about them. Unfortunately, I was pretty young. A lot of things I wish I could have asked them, but didn't know enough at the time to do it because I was too young.